This is Alexander Scott, a member of Lands, presenting this edition of our weekly updates. Before we continue, please visit our website at jalands.org or follow us on social media. Our Twitter handle is @lands_JA. We will begin with foreign affairs. The recent United States election and inauguration of Joe Biden and his Democratic Party team seems to have elicited joy in some parts of the world, where people think the actions of the US will now change because Trump is no longer in office. In an article from Reuters titled, "Biden Will Recognize Guaido as Venezuela's Leader, Top Diplomat Says," the now confirmed Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, insists that the new Biden administration will maintain the recognition of Guaido as interim president of Venezuela, and stated to the US Congress that his State Department, that is Blinken's State Department, would seek to more effectively target sanctions on that country, that is Venezuela, in order to remove President Maduro. Now, in another article, this time titled, "US Will Join Nuclear Deal If Iran Complies with Provisions," Blinken, this time in the Times of India, we are informed that while the new Biden administration wishes to re-enter the JCPOA, which, let's bear in mind, that Donald Trump and the United States unilaterally walked away from, leaving just the EU and Iran, they, that is the United States, will not re-enter the deal until Iran resumes complying with the deal, meaning that the sanctions imposed on that nation by the previous administration, the Trump administration, will remain in place. Another reason why these sanctions will remain in place is because Iran does not want to restart the negotiation process. They have the firm belief, and the correct belief, quite frankly, that if the United States cannot maintain the previous deal and the previous terms under that deal, why would they re-enter a new deal? They will start new negotiations on a new deal once the United States re-enters the JCPOA. These actions, some of the first foreign policy movements from that country, the United States, since the transition of power, we think shows that regardless of which party is in charge, the imperial agenda is followed to a T. The issues we in the global south face from the US and other neocolonial powers are not partisan, and they're not relegated to one party, be they Republican or Democratic in the United States or Conservative or Labour in the United Kingdom. The issues are bipartisan. It is an agreed consensus on how to ensure the flow of profits continues and how power remains in the hands of the former colonizers. This bipartisanship is seen through the Bush to Biden presidencies, a span of 20 years, where the mantra on Venezuela has remained the same: the overthrow of the Bolivarian Revolution. We see much the same thing with Iran, where, as mentioned earlier, after the United States walked away from the deal, the new Biden administration now wants the same unacceptable terms that the Trump administration is demanding so that the United States can re-enter this deal that they walked away from. No US administration will ever have the thoughts of their people, let alone the people of the global south, as their priorities. And while it is understandable why we in the global south invest so much time and attention to their politics because we are invariably affected by their policies, we must never lose sight of the fact that they, the neo-colonialist powers, and the United States itself, as the imperial hegemon, will not help us. As the sanctions on Venezuela, which have already cost over 40,000 lives, continues, and the squeezing of Iran intensifies, just to speak of two countries still suffering under US aggression, we hope that these initial actions by this new administration act as an eye-opener to to the fact that the global north countries do not have our best interests at heart, and that we in the global south need to push for greater integration and unity if we are to not only stand up to aggression, but to also thrive collectively. Next, we move on to Jamaica's COVID 19 management and our vaccine rollout. An article in The Observer titled Government Holds Discussions with China, Cuba, and India on Vaccines, on COVID 19 vaccines. We saw the Health Minister, Christopher Tufton, announce that Cabinet had given approval for the ministry to source safe vaccines from other facilities outside of the COVAX facility. And following that statement, he went on to say that the health minister, had entered discussions with Cuba, India, and China in an effort to access their vaccines once they become available. This this comes after it was recently stated by the said minister that while the Jamaican state would not be accessing the Cuban vaccines because they're not approved by the COVAX facility, they would not bar Jamaican citizens from accessing that Cuban vaccine. This is welcome news, especially at this moment when the COVAX facility is struggling to distribute vaccines and even get vaccines, and when we see some vaccines going to waste inadvertently due to poor storage. And that is something we in Jamaica and other global south countries need to think about, that poor storage. Um, the Cuban, Chinese, and Indian vaccines can be stored at higher temperatures than most of the vaccines currently available in the COVAX facility. All that in mind, it is important that the government looks as far and wide as possible to access the vaccines, and this is an excellent move. Now, as we do this, we are also reasserting some of our independence because the vaccines, especially those from Cuba and China, as mentioned earlier, do not fall under the COVAX facility because they're not FDA approved drugs. Now, what this means, the reasserting of our independence, is that Jamaican doctors, the Jamaican government, and Jamaican medical authorities are now deciding what Jamaican doctors will administer as a safe vaccine to Jamaican citizens as opposed to outsourcing it to or going by the book of the FDA's approved drug list. We really hope that these potential deals, also that we're currently negotiating with China, India, and Cuba, will mean the beginning of greater South-South trade, which we firmly believe, is needed if we are to develop in a fashion other than one which is dictated to us from outside. Staying on the topic of our COVID rollout, in an article carried by the Gleaner titled "Vaccine Sales Top Agenda: Business Group Mulls Putting Jab on Open Market," it was reported that a private sector group made up of the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica, the Jamaica Manufacturing and Exporters Association, and the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce is seeking to partner with the Health Ministry so they can import vaccines. These vaccines, according to the consortium, will be distributed amongst the employees free of cost, um, even though that is up to the discretion of the individual company. While the health minister, Christopher Tufton, noted that Jamaica has a long history of both public sector and open market access to vaccines, he, he emphasized his belief that those who can pay for the vaccine should pay for it, while those who cannot pay for it should be and must be provided for by the state in a timely fashion, in a prompt fashion. The moves taken by the private sector, they're very commendable. Even if we do harbor some skepticism, we share some skepticism about how they will be distributed and if they will in fact be kept off the black market. If we are to return to some form of normal, then everyone, or at least the majority of the population, will need access to this vaccine. And we will need to then have some of this vaccine as a reserve in the event that this flares up again. As the negotiations surrounding this deal continue and they intensify, the government must insist, we think, on the free availability of the vaccine to the employees. And if at all possible, they must then insist that any surplus vaccine that is had is going to be stored in a national centralized storage place, so issues to access and distribution, which we are currently facing, we're not facing in the future. The issue of national health, it cannot and should not be left in the hands of the private sector. And because they have more money, that is, the private sector has more money than the state itself, if this is done, then they could very well import more than the state. Strict regulations, therefore, are needed. Again, we welcome the move by the representatives of private capital, even if it is only in their self interest and for self preservation. We now must ensure that the vaccine, which, as we have seen from our CARICOM neighbors such as Antigua, Dominica, Barbados, remains difficult to access, is fairly and equitably distributed and not hoarded or used to turn a profit. Finally, we end with the disabled community and the recent spate of violence against our homeless citizens. Two recent articles in the Jamaica Observer, one titled "Persons with Disabilities Must Have Full Access to Public Buildings," says Lambert Brown, and an editorial titled "Fancy Buildings but No Provisions for the Disabled," highlighted the fact that municipal buildings in both Westmoreland and Portmore are not built with persons with disabilities in mind, and that they lack either ramps and elevators or easy access to either ramps or elevators. The article goes on to note that Jamaica, as a signatory to the conventions of the rights of persons with disabilities, and with our own Disabilities Act yet to be ratified, the local authorities should be ensuring that buildings are put up with the consultation and consideration of and from persons with disabilities as to how they can best access them, and issues of lack of funding should not come into play. The editorial, while also touching on that issue, broadened the conversation and noted that persons with disabilities in general still face issues as it relates to accessing justice and suitable security, highlighting the recent robbery of Creative Craft Plus, a work scheme operated by and for the benefit of the visually impaired community, and the rape and murder of a 17-year-old girl with Down syndrome. In the Gleaner article titled "Four Homeless Men Killed in the Corporate Area," it spoke of the heinous attacks on 6 homeless individuals, which resulted in the death of 5. These men suffered chop wounds, and the suspect has since been held in custody. RJR carried a story titled "Government's Homeless Assistance Program Lacks Structure," in which the public defender Arlene Harrison Henry stated that the assistance programs offered by the state for the homeless individuals, homeless citizens, are woefully inadequate, with things such as records of individuals staying at homeless shelters not being kept, and that more needs to be done to ensure that members of the homeless community can live with some dignity, such as offering decent food and adequate shelter, for example. These incidents, we feel, highlight not just the carelessness and failure of the state in multiple areas, which have been commented on regularly, but also how callous we as a society are and have become when it comes to handling members of disadvantaged communities. While the murders of the homeless men are heinous, they really are, how can they be surprising if we have a culture which sees these individuals, homeless people, as less than, where the mocking of homeless individuals is condoned, and where abuse just short of the type reported on recently is ignored? While the theft of the monies from the visually impaired community is sad, It is not unexpected if, again, these people and that community are treated like helpless cases in need of handouts instead of persons with capabilities and feelings like everyone else. We must move beyond sympathy for these people at the best of times. Regularized and fully equipped shelters are a start for the homeless, but we must also have the social workers and therapists there so these people can re enter society as opposed to remaining homeless. Persons with disabilities must have more than, for example, access to public spaces and must be afforded easier access to all the amenities that those of us without disabilities can readily and unthinkingly access and, in fact, take for granted. We at Lands hope that these incidents spur us to do the right thing by our marginalized communities, or communities which have not had their voices heard or their views taken on board. The passage and enforcement of the Disabilities Act is a must if we are to ensure that persons with disabilities, are not treated as the other. And the beefing up of funding for homeless shelters and even the integration and the involvement of the private sector there is needed so as to provide adequate food and overnight housing as well as the social care which is needed. We also feel an education and sensitization program is needed, something which has previously been mooted, if we are to change the current majority mindset and to begin to view persons with disabilities and homeless people as just that, people, people with the same rights and guarantees that we are all entitled to, that we all want, that we all clamor for, and that we all demand and insist are respected. Once again, this is Alexander Scott presenting this week's edition of Lands Updates.